order the Saline City Council work meeting on February 5th, 2018. Members present are myself, Mayor Marl, Councilmember Shio, Mayor William Carr, Councilwoman Dillon, Councilman Gearbob, Councilwoman McClellan. Councilwoman Mitchell will be absent from tonight's work meeting, but she should be here for the regular meeting. City staff, we have City Manager Campbell, Deputy Clerk Blue, Deputy Director Fordyce, City Superintendent Engineer Rubel is here, along with wastewater treatment superintendent Skull is here, along with City Attorney Scott Smith. Brian Rubel, we welcome you here this evening as well. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as submitted unless there are amendments?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by McClellan. It's been properly moved by Dillon, seconded by McClellan to approve the agenda as submitted. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it, the motion carries unanimously. We come now to public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comment or question to City Council. This public comment period will be limited to 2 minutes per person. Anyone who would like to speak is requested but not required to say his or her name and address for the record. Then we will welcome you to speak at the podium to my left. Public comments. Then we will proceed to the discussion portion of our agenda. Again, Deputy Clerk Bloom has hard copies of the PowerPoint presentations, but I believe Mr. Campbell also emailed them out Friday afternoon. Very good. I'm going to turn it over to you. The only thing that I will add from our last regular council meeting is, one, the way we manage and oversee these large projects is of critical importance, because in the past, mistakes were made and the outcomes were less than ideal. So we wanted to talk about that subject broadly and then touch on our ongoing efforts to control noxious odors at the wastewater treatment plant. So unless there are questions from me, I'm going to turn it over to City Manager Campbell, and then I think we're going to engage Mr. Rubel and city staff very quickly thereafter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I noticed there's no green lights on the other. So you want to, on the bottom side, there's a button on the bottom side. Should pop on green.
Yeah, just to reiterate for council members, staff, and our guests.
Yeah, if you hold it down, then it'll. You're green now, Heidi. Yep. You were. You may have turned it off. You don't. You just hold it down for a second. Yep. No, it's the. Yep.
There it goes.
So it flashes red, and then you should let go. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you. So just very briefly, so we can get into this, this was brought up, as the mayor mentioned, a while back in working with Mr. Smith and Mr. Rubel, putting this the first part of the work session together as far as managing large construction projects and kind of step by step, if you will, and to help folks better understand that process. And then we also wanted, it was obviously very timely for this particular, the managing the construction projects, as well as give you an update on the odor abatement project as we're moving forward, as that continues to move forward. And I believe March 1st is still scheduled for bidding it out. So we'll continue to move and make progress, but we thought this would be an appropriate time to do that as well, to get you all up to speed on what's going on and then go from there. So unless there's any questions or comments from me, I will turn over to Brian.
Well, thank you. So again, I think I have about 15 slides here just to kind of give an overview of how a major public works project gets completed. It's a very complex subject, and quite frankly, it's a subject they don't teach in engineering school. I suspect they don't teach it in law school, and I'm fairly certain they don't teach it in city council school. So it's certainly not something that is well informed, well trained in all of us. We pick it up as we go. Actually, before I forget, Mitch is here tonight. Mitch actually lives in the Saline area, and he's one of my colleagues at Tetra Tech. Has had a major role in your odor control project. He asked, hadn't been to many city council meetings, asked if he could attend, and I gladly took him up on that offer. So Mitch is going to help with the slides. So this won't cover everything on a construction project, but we'll hit some highlights here. And this slide just shows a typical flow path. Construction projects can take many forms. What I'm going to talk about tonight is kind of a traditional form that we call a design-bid-build type of approach, where you have a design professional, does drawings and specifications. You'll put it out to contractor bids, that's the bid part, and then the build part is where the contractor takes over and steers the project to completion. And this probably is pretty straightforward for all of us. We have to define what the project is by doing a study. We need to understand what the problem is and what the solutions are. The study will then identify alternatives to attack and solve the problem. Related to the study is determining the funding. How are we going to, what source are we going to apply for? What are the prerequisites for that funding? Then we prepare the design documents, which also convert to a set of bid documents. Many parts of that, we'll talk more about that as we go, but it'll have a permitting step. We'll define products that we want to bid on. We'll provide who's acceptable, what kind of manufacturers we wish to have. It will also outline some schedule constraints for the contract. We'll take bids, usually through a competitive process. It doesn't have to be, but that's usually what a public body chooses to do. Once we get the bids, we'll review the bids. The consultant will provide a recommendation to a public body to act upon that. We'll move to a construction phase, and then actually a project has two different completion phases to it. There's one phase that we call substantial completion. That means you have beneficial use of the product. It is working, it is functional. It may not be 100% complete, but it is doing what it is intended to do. And this closeout step, we'll talk about that as we go. Hopefully it's not lengthy, but sometimes it can drag out. And then the final completion is where everything is complete on the contract and it is ready for final payment.
So understand that this is a typical process. It's not the only way to do it. You can have design-build contracts instead of design-bid-build contracts, and you can introduce construction managers. You can introduce a lot of other ways of handling a construction project. Also understand that in some cases, due to time constraints, we may compress some of these steps. We may take them out of order. You might have to have design and bid documents, for example, before you get grant and loan applications in, depending on the agency process. Understand that if you've got an MDOT component, you're using MDOT forms, and MDOT has its own bidding process that it goes through, so you have to comply with all of that. Understand that at times these sequences get changed or elongated. If you've got a rural development project, United States Department of Agriculture Rural Development, they have a lot of extra steps to go through, from a pre-application step and so forth. The design bid part of this step can sometimes take a year, year and a half. If you're designing a sewer project, you've got to do the design of the project, then you've got to get permitting, and the permit review time is 180 days. And that's assuming that they don't kick it back and you don't have to redo something to get the permit, because the DEQ has changed what it's looking for in terms of those design documents. So this is a very detailed kind of thing, and as you can see from just the bid specs for this project, there's an immense amount of detail. So we've got 700 pages in a document here, including all the contract documents and all of the bid specs, and those bid specs then refer to various things in the plans which give dimensions and so forth. There may also be, in the design process, you may have to go get soil borings, you may have to do environmental work, there may be property acquisition, so there may be a lot of other steps involved in the process, and a lot of moving parts that have to move together. Any one of those moving parts that don't move exactly as anticipated can throw the whole process off. So if you're having trouble getting an easement or some other property, that can delay the whole process.
We can stop at any point and
Brian, make sure that mic is a little bit closer.
yeah, we can stop at any point and take questions on this. The bid docs, this document here also references the drawings. As most of this, it actually makes up the technical specifications for the projects, the products that are used. So in this case, the fans, the ductwork, all those things have chapters written in here. And they're, to the extent they can, they're tailored to the specific project. It's a custom project, so every paragraph is reviewed and customized for the needs of the project at hand. It also contains a contract, and related to the contract, it contains what we call general conditions. So it outlines things like warranties, meetings that the contractor needs to attend, all the administrative steps of the contract, of executing that contract. It includes all the insurance, all the bond requirements, and it includes a bid form, which is what we actually open on bid day, so it'll have the pricing and outline for what we want to see at the pricing. I talked about the general conditions. We might even include the permit if we have obtained that and make that part of the contract, the bid and then subsequently the contract. So the bid documents then are copied and then referenced into the eventual contract that is executed.
And understand that the bid documents make certain assumptions. So we make assumptions as to the environmental condition of the property by taking some samples across the site, and the soil conditions by doing soil borings across the site. So if you've got a several acre site that you're working with, we may take half a dozen soil samples or groundwater samples and extrapolate from there, because you simply can't poke holes every 6 inches to determine what those site conditions are, which means that there's always a possibility after the construction starts that you're going to find something you didn't know exists. Same thing if you're renovating a building. When we recently renovated the rec center, you'll recall that Mays came in and explained in excruciating detail that they've pulled some of the panels off the side and taken a look at some of those conditions, but as they get into it, they may find that the water damage that occurred either from moisture from inside the building or coming from outside the building would require change of more of the decking or more of the structural components or that kind of thing, because as you get into a project, you may discover conditions that didn't exist before.
Bidding and award. So we received the bids. Many ways to actually pick a contractor. Some of your funding requirements outline a process. For instance, the revolving fund loan, we do need to pick the lowest fee from a contractor that's deemed responsive, has met all the bid requirements. We can't bypass the low one to pick another one without justifying that in some detail. Another way to pick contractors, not all the funding mechanisms allow it, but is to pre-qualify the contractors before you even open the bid. I'd like to do that. That way we don't have to even open a bid from somebody that hasn't gone through a prior process to qualify themselves as responsive. SRF won't allow that, but other funding mechanisms may. It's been quite helpful to me in the past. It's hard to exclude a low bid contractor who's not qualified. So if you only open those that you think are already qualified, it does make things a little easier at that time. I would recommend that you always check the qualifications of the contractors. I think we all have situations we've seen where, one service provider isn't equal to another. So knowing that they've completed a project of similar complexity sure gives us all a lot of confidence that they can complete the present project. So the consultant will review all of that, provide a recommendation the best they can to the community. And clearly, you understand that that's a council's job to take all that into consideration and award a contract with that information. Anything more, Scott?
Yeah, you know, when you do contractor selection, there can be a variety of reasons why a contractor won't be selected. Might not be on the pre-qualification list, might be debarred by state or federal agencies, so they're not qualified with the particular funding source. There may be an inability to get the required bonds or insurance. I've had that on more than one occasion where they're the winning bidder, but they can't get the bonds or insurance that's needed. Sometimes they lack the equipment to do the job. Their references can be bad. I've had situations where reference checks say, whatever you do, don't sign up with these guys. Previous experiences that we've had with a contractor may dictate that we don't want to work with that contractor again. We try to determine not only that the contractor has the ability and a good reputation, but also that the contractor has the resources to apply to this project along with all of the other projects that contractor may have going on. And it's not only the contractor that's important, but the assigned personnel. You have an entirely different experience with a contractor depending on who they've assigned to be the foreman for the project or the project manager. So even with the same contractor, you can have vastly different experiences depending on that, and depending on how busy the contractor is and how much equipment they have available to put on the project. You can have vastly different experiences if they have different subcontractors. You can have vastly different experiences depending on the work to be performed. So some general contractors are great when it comes to excavating and that kind of work, but if you're talking about vertical construction, they're not so good. Or you talk about a technical plant. The times of year, weather conditions, job conditions, and other factors can affect performance. So even if you've got a contractor who's got a great reputation, always does good work, you can have circumstances that lead you to have an entirely different experience than you had on a previous occasion, or an entirely different experience than references have had. Right now, when contractors are very busy, it's sometimes difficult because they've got new people managing projects who haven't been project managers before. And their resources are spread thin, so your experiences are different than they would have been back at times when they weren't so busy.
Contracts, and I'm going to lump what I referred to as general conditions into this discussion. General conditions, again, are documents that indicate how a contractor is going to serve the community. What are the expectations for shop drawings, and we'll talk more about shop drawings in a minute, warranties, meetings, all that sort of thing. In the odor control, and this is pretty standard documents, there's 77 pages requiring how the contractor is going to work with the community. Not one technical spec in there, just day-to-day what their responsibilities are. So it's very, very important and very lengthy. Many times when what these read are different from community to community. For instance, Ann Arbor has 40 pages of that they require to be in every contract. Smaller communities don't have their own standards and therefore generally use something from a trade group. And there's a couple up there listed. They're fairly similar, but most parties, communities, engineering and contracting communities are familiar with those standard documents. So at the time of bid, they don't necessarily have to read every word because they are familiar with those. So that is one of the few standardized parts of a contract that assist in putting that together. I know you had some comments on that, Scott.
Yeah, if you do an MDOT project, MDOT has preferred forms. If you do an MDOT airport project, they won't let you deviate from their contract forms. The United States Department of Agriculture Rural Development has forms. EDA has particular contract requirements. Sometimes they're just additions that have to go in, non-discrimination provisions, debarment provisions, and other kinds of things that state or federal grants require to be added to contracts. I tend not to be a fan of AIA contracts because I think they tend to give a lot of power to the design professional without giving them a corresponding amount of responsibility. So usually when we have an AIA contract recommended, we suggest a number of changes that go with an addendum to the contract. The EJCDC forms are a lot better than that, and they've really come a long ways in the last several years. Really what we look for in the contract is to make sure everybody is working for the owner, for you. So the engineer, the architect should be making recommendations to you, not making decisions you have to comply with. We want the contractor working for you so that, again, you make the decisions and you're in the driver's seat before any payments are made. So we try to make sure that the contracts work in that kind of way. And Brian's right, a lot of our clients have standardized contracts. City of Grand Rapids does, City of Wyoming does, a lot of larger communities have standardized their contract documents to deviate from other standard forms. And sometimes they standardize those and put in local preference provisions and other kinds of things in the bid documents as well.
Just very quick, can you tell me what those acronyms are, what they stand for?
American Institute of Architects and the,
Engineers Joint Contract Document Committee, I believe.
Yeah,
Something very
something
similar
like
to
that.
that.
Contract, what was the D part?
Document Committee, I think. Close enough, yep.
well, if you put in just that acronym, you'll find it on Google.
So the lines of responsibility on a project, the relationship between the parties, I've done my best to illustrate up here, and it's not terribly clear if you don't do this quite often. The owner's at the center of it. They're the owner of the project. Everybody is serving the owner, municipality in your case, but obviously there's many, many parties involved, financial advisors, bond attorneys, perhaps even your city attorney for various inputs. There'll be a design engineer up in the right side, and maybe a materials testing firm. Could be contracted directly by the owner of the project. And there will be a separate design contract. So I think that's clear to everybody in this room that the owner has a separate contract with a general contractor. And that general contractor will have perhaps dozens of support firms, mechanical subs, electrical subs, suppliers of materials. Really could be dozens of suppliers. And if you think about it, they're thrown together at a very short period of time preparing a bid. They may never have worked together before. The general contractor's out there trying to find the lowest cost for all those services because that's how he's awarded the job, the lowest cost. And it's better when they've worked together before, it seems like, but sometimes they haven't. The unique product, unique material, sometimes they've never worked together before. And they're learning how to do that on the project. Of course, one of the roles of the engineer is to help administer the construction contract, and I have that as a dashed line because there is communication daily between the engineer and the contractor, yet the contractor is not working under contract with the engineer. That contract goes back to the owner. I think everybody here understands that. I do work for several smaller communities that only do a project every 5 or 6 years, and they do not understand that. And that's important because the engineer cannot direct the contractor. They can suggest things, they can monitor things, but they cannot direct the means and methods of the contractor.
In fact, we want to be very careful not to direct the means and methods because then you get into problems if the contractor backs into somebody, if somebody's injured on the job, you can be held liable if you're trying to tell the contractor how to do their job. So we have specs that might indicate in what sequences things have to be done, because we need that sequence in order to properly construct a project. But even then, oftentimes we don't try to specify sequences either. We try to leave it up to the contractor to figure out how best to accomplish the job to comply with the specs. Now, what we do is say you can't cover up work until we've had an opportunity to inspect it, right? You can't put drywall until we've looked at the plumbing and the electrical. You can't cover that hole until we've checked the joints and the angle of the pipe for the sewer project.
That's all I had.
Yep.
Okay. So, related to that, that contract that the consultant administers, some of the tasks are, preparing the contracts, getting those ready for signature. One of the key steps, they clearly do not teach this in engineering school, is before a product is delivered to site, in fact, before it's even ordered, there is a submittal made by the manufacturer, which goes to the contractor, which goes to the engineer. It's called a shop drawing. The purpose of that submittal is, is what the contractor proposes to bring to the site, does it meet the requirements of this specification? That's a very important step, because it avoids a lot of disputes. Because if they were to manufacture that, bring it to the site, and it's not what any of us wants, now we've got tens of thousands of dollars invested in something that we refuse to accept. And it's got to go back, and can you imagine the fight that would happen? So the shop drawing process is a fairly lengthy process, but it's a very important process to make sure that we get a product that we are all happy with and meets these specifications. So that's a big part of the early part of the project. Ma'am?
The owner or the mediator of that? Like, who's overseeing that process?
Well, the engineer does all the reviews. The contractor prepares all the submittals.
Because we're going back to the previous slide that you were saying that the contractor and the engineer don't
Well, those,
necessarily work
yeah.
together. And I just wonder who's overseeing.
So the engineer oversees it, and the way I like to write the documents, the engineer then makes a recommendation to the owner as to whether to accept those shop drawings or not. As a practical matter, we're going to rely on the engineer almost all of the time. But if there's, sometimes during that process, they'll come in with a product submittal that's a little different than what was spec'd, and they'll ask to substitute something for what was spec'd, and then there will be some conversation with the owner about that.
Very much so. Yep. So reviewing the pay applications, making sure that contractors paid an appropriate amount, an equitable amount as the project proceeds. You don't want to, they're due some progress payment, but you don't want to pay them more than the work they've done too. Always interpretations of these documents. Something isn't entirely clear on the drawing, so interpreting that, what the intention was there, goes on. There's progress meetings, usually on a monthly basis on big projects. I think, Mitch, it wraps to the next page too, I think.
Yes.
Reviewing the work, not necessarily the daily inspection. We'll talk about that in the next slide. We issue various certificates as things get completed. We do sign-offs on equipment and startups, record drawings. So after the project is completed, it's always built a little differently than it's designed. For whatever reason, we find something underground. So preparing a drawing at the end indicating exactly how it went in is important for the future project. Important to maintain the system, to understand where everything is. And then just closing it out, the paperwork, the funding source has various forms and that sort of a thing, and close out. So that's part of just administering the contract.
So, everybody know who Jack Reacher is? The fictional character in Lee Child novels? He likes to say, plans go to hell as soon as the first shot is fired, right? So, as soon as the contract gets underway, something's going to deviate a bit from the plans that everybody had set out. So I've already talked about soils and soil conditions or environmental conditions. I had a situation in one contract where they opened up the intersection and found all kinds of utility lines running in every direction believable. There were gas lines and electric lines, stuff dating back a century or more. And it took several weeks to get the utilities in there to sort out what was live and what wasn't live anymore, and to pull that out and deal with it. We've had key personnel become unavailable through illness or a death, or they're lured away by a competitor. We've had shipping problems result in delays on materials or equipment. Once had a train derailment take out a whole bunch of stuff that was needed, and it was going to take several months to manufacture that stuff again. I've had customs issues. I had a manufacturing plant explosion and subsequent fire. You can have other nearby projects that interfere with your timetable because of what they're doing. You can have a change in die lot so that your outside paneling changes colors from time to time, and nobody anticipated that. I've had picketing and demonstrations, we've had bankruptcies, we've had creditors repossessing equipment. I've run into endangered species on one project that brought it to a halt. You may remember a few years ago, a project in Flint came to a halt because they ran into artifacts and burial sites of Native Americans. So you can imagine just about anything that can go wrong in life can affect your construction project. And part of what contract administration is addressing those problems. There's always, almost always going to be a problem or a difficulty or something that was unforeseen that you have to work through and deal with. That's just part of what it is. They never go according to plan.
Another task is just called resident observation. We try to avoid the word inspector, but essentially it's somebody observing the work, making sure that that contractor you hire is building the project that he contracted to do. It's a set of eyes representing the municipality. To me, it's probably the most important person on the project. When I have a good observer out there, the project goes so much better. I'll just deviate slightly from this. We had a project up in Macomb County. The community wanted to use, for this task, wanted to use their electrical inspector with absolutely no training or qualifications, and I refuse to even do the project because I think it will be an utter disaster by having somebody completely unqualified out watching the contractor. I'd rather not even be part of that project. So that is how important that person is. It can be part-time or it can be full-time. A lot of the wastewater projects can be done well part-time because you can generally see the object afterwards. You can go up and see it. The underground projects generally require full-time observation because they're backfilling as they go, and you need to see it as they go. So you know that's essentially what they're doing, making sure that they're building what you're paying them to build. They're keeping very detailed records, photographs, keeping track of pertinent things that go on. They're calling back to the office saying, can you please help me? We ran into an obstruction. We have to go around it. We've got to come up with a solution. Mitch has probably got a dozen stories he could tell about things that just have to be done on the fly very quickly sometimes, so you don't hold them up, but accurately. So it's a real challenge to do both. Things change out there, and it's important to have somebody out there watching it.
Contractors can be sneaky and unscrupulous, or subcontractors can in some cases. The contractor can be perfectly responsible, but somebody else doing the project. I had worked with a community on a project. They were putting a new water main in a downtown, and that downtown didn't have everything good as built because it was built back in the late 19th century, right? Late 1800s. And this contractor came, and if the line wasn't on the plan, they cut the line. Well, it turned out they cut a whole bunch of sewer lines coming out of buildings, sewer laterals, and sewers began backing up all over downtown. To make matters worse, this contractor, the person who was in charge of the project and on the ground, the foreman for the project, he had to leave at 3 o'clock every Friday and didn't arrive until noon on Monday because he was spending his weekends in jail and was only on work release. And jail was clear across the other side of the state. So that's why we recommend a resident observer and why it's important to have somebody watching the project.
Very much so. Just a word about the next slide about equipment procurement. We're all used to daily life. We need a can of soup, it's on the shelf at Kroger. We want a watermelon, it's on the shelf at Meijer. Unfortunately, that doesn't translate well to complex public works projects. Everything primarily is custom. It doesn't exist at the time of the bid. It is manufactured for the specific need according to these specifications. And that takes some time. We go through a couple submittals. Usually it takes about twice to get what is really in here and what we really need, because somebody doesn't, the shop doesn't really pay close enough attention the first time. So they'll prepare this submittal. It'll take 3 or 4 weeks. The engineer will get it. It'll take a week to 2 for us to look at it, give comments back to the manufacturer. They will resubmit. Hopefully at that point it is correct. We will review it again, issue direction on that, and only after that final review will they start to manufacture the product. And it takes about 12 weeks, sometimes 16 weeks to manufacture our equipment. That's pretty standard for most pieces of equipment. Then once it's on site, it takes 4 weeks, 6 weeks to get the electrical hooked up, the plumbing hooked up, the foundation set. So it's a good 6 to 9 months since a contract is signed until a major piece of equipment is there and operable.
And sometimes that's I can remember after Hurricane Katrina, when there was an electric project being done by an electric utility owned by one of our clients, and they had a 180-day wait for anything with any kind of copper in it. Simply because the materials, they couldn't mine the materials fast enough and build the electrical equipment, the transformers, the condensers, and so forth. And so sometimes you find other market disruptions. Sometimes we can squeeze this delivery time and squeeze a manufacturer to get something done quicker, but every time you do that, you squeeze out in your process the chance, the ability to deal with unforeseen problems with something that doesn't come in with the right quantity or the right quality. You end up with or weather delays, so you remove your time cushions when you do that. You also remove sometimes the ability of the manufacturer to provide the kind of testing and quality assurance that they want to have when they send out this special made equipment for your project. And so you want to be careful not to squeeze too much if you can avoid it in your time frames.
I think we're good, Mitch. Closeout, just finishing up the contract, lots of little steps there. There are manuals that allow the operators to operate the equipment. We look at warranties, we prepare those record drawings, we restore the site. It's amazing how many projects go great and then we can't get the grass to grow. what should be the easiest thing drags on months. Pay applications, release of sureties, and so forth. Important parts of the project, things that seem to take longer than everybody would like them to.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide.
Yeah. Big, complex projects, there's lots of risks. There's lots of ways that we try to manage those risks with these documents in particular. Underground projects always carry a risk because we can't see underground. We don't know what's under there. Mr. Smith's given you some great examples of that. Try to take soil borings. It's always good to budget a little bit more than you think, just in case you find something. The general contractor goes bankrupt. I believe that happened on the city's water plant. So we have, the contractor posts a bond, so the bond holder, the bond issuer, has to pay then for somebody else to come in and finish the project. So we demand that those bonds are there to protect the municipality. Just getting the contractor to finish at times can be a bit of a challenge. Again, he has a bond to ensure that he finishes too, so somebody else can come in. We retain money. We do not pay them 100% of the work that they've done along the way. We hold back. There's a statute, state law spells out how much we can hold back. So we'll hold back some just to give them a stimulus to finish, and then they get that held money. There's liquidated damages. We've had that discussion in the past. Contractor competency. I'm a big believer in checking references. I talked about the pre-qualification process. When the funding mechanism allows it, I think it's a good one to consider. Cost is always a risk. Unknown cost. Competitively bidding the contract helps keep the cost down. The competitions that we go through on suppliers. Just bidding at the right time of the year can be a huge asset. Bidding in the winter generally is you get lower cost than bidding it in the middle of summer because they're hungry for work for the year. So it's a good strategy. Anything else, Scott?
Well, it's an effort to try to avoid problems later,
Yeah.
but when you have bid specs that are this complex and plans that are that many pages, somebody is going to have overlooked something. Somebody bidding a project is going to estimate the wrong quantity. There's somebody's going to order the wrong amount. We're going to have other situations where problems just have to be worked out. You can't expect to go through a 1.5-year design, bid, build process without having some problems.
All sorts of other risks that these projects. Safety, we haven't really talked about that, but we don't want anybody to get hurt. And fortunately, these are very dangerous sites, so that does happen sometimes. Retrofitting an old facility, I think of your wastewater plant when I think of an old facility, it is much more challenging than a new project. If you had a blank piece of land with never been built on, if you were to design a wastewater plant in a green field like that, there would be much fewer problems than trying to retrofit something on a site that's been used for decades. You'll find stuff, things don't fit. It's just more challenging.
It's like a This Old House episode, right? You get into it, there's always something else. And on top of that, you're also trying to keep the facility operating while you're making the improvements, which itself is a logistical challenge.
Related to that is just every project is customized. Bob's operations has specific needs, specific suppliers to fit in the site, specific spaces to put things in that don't fit. So it's custom. There is not a one-size-fits-all odor control system. It is designed specifically for your processes, your dimensions, your site, your topography. Fragmented suppliers. I thought it when I wrote this slide. I bet there are 40 to 50 different manufacturers of water, wastewater, electrical, mechanical equipment that we work with every day. So it's not like buying a car where there's 3 U.S. suppliers and a couple foreign suppliers. There's 40 or 50 different suppliers that are dealing with. Some go out of business. Some products don't fit well with each other. So just going through all those combinations to make sure is a challenge on these kinds of projects. Another interesting challenge is general contractors don't even have a licensing requirement in Michigan. Anybody can be a general contractor. The trades do, the mechanical trades, electrical trades, they all have licensing requirements, but these general contractors don't.
Home builders do.
Yeah, home builders do, yeah. Next slide, Mitch. Industry standards. Very few of the equipment that we have has an industry standard. So everyone has a different dimension, different size, different capacity. So getting all that to fit together is one of the challenges that we go through. I think I've emphasized that second bullet. This equipment is very expensive, and it is not sitting on the shelf anywhere. It is manufactured specifically for each order. So it takes a long time to get it, and unfortunately, sometimes there aren't spare parts if something happens. So we usually order spare parts for most of our stuff, but that's a challenge. Weather, too hot, too cold, too wet. We talked about personnel. One contractor can do a great job because they had a great project manager and struggle on the next one, just less competent individual. And we're almost done. No two projects are the same. It's custom. Everyone is unique and tailored to specific needs. There are dozens of parties on a contract, and if anyone lets you down, kind of the whole thing falls apart. So that's a challenge. Many risks. We hope we've gone through some of the ways to manage risks, and unfortunately, these do take a long time to complete, and despite the fact they take a long time to complete, day-to-day things happen pretty quickly. There's thousands, tens of thousands of decisions that go in, both during design and construction, and we get most of them right, but occasionally with some of those are challenges, and we go back and revisit those. So, I'm not sure if that's what you expected, but I think we gave it an overview tonight.
I think that was a very well-prepared presentation, gentlemen. Thank you for being so thorough, and we appreciate your attention to detail. Is there anyone from city staff who'd like to add anything at this time? Mr. Skull? Why don't you grab the mic from Mr. Rubel, Mr. Brian Rubel?
I think Mr. Rubel had hit it on the head. Every project's very complicated. There's always unforeseen events. Pipes that weren't supposed to be there, manufacturers are late with their production. With the water plant, we actually had a union disagreement at one time. So there's always, it's always changing and always, evolving as the project goes.
Very good. Mr. Campbell, anything at this time? Very good. Well, why don't we open it up for questions? A couple things. Due to the absence of Councilwoman Mitchell, I assume that you will follow up with her and offer to meet to discuss this issue since it is of critical importance. Additionally, Mayor Pro Tem Tahar, I'm going to ask you to take the helm in about 5 to 10 minutes. Lieutenant Cornell is leaving the fire department. They're having a farewell party, and I've been invited to stop by, albeit briefly. The only other thing that I would add, in addition to thanking Mr. Brian Rubel and Mr. Smith for their presentation, is to say that, and a few of us have spoken about this, one of the things that I really hope to emulate in the future is the approach and the standards that we used with the recent roof rehabilitation project at the rec center. Because I think there was the appropriate level of oversight and accountability that resulted in what we currently perceive to be a close to ideal outcome. And that standard and that approach hasn't always been followed in the past. It comes with an additional cost, but I think it's absolutely imperative. And I think you agree. And I think it's an approach that's required for the project that we're about to be undertaking at the wastewater treatment plant. What we'll do, Mr. Rubel, Mr. Smith, is go around the table with questions. When the questions are exhausted, do you want to maybe spend then 15, 20 minutes talking a little bit about the odor abatement at wastewater treatment plant? Sound like a plan? Excellent. Mr. Seo, I'm going to start with you and end with Mayor Pro Tem Tahar. And again, please make sure you're speaking into the microphone.
guess the only question I would have would be if you ever find an ideal project that goes exactly according to plan, I'd love to know what it is, where it occurred, and how it went down, because having worked for the radio system that I did, and having been responsible for having to put in 4 brand-new tower sites for radios, co-locate on 3 existing tower sites, dealing with property owners, dealing with the road commission, dealing with MDEQ, dealing with the state of Michigan, I understand a lot of what you're talking
In
about.
fact, I'm going through that right now for the Kent County Dispatch Authority, doing exactly the same kind of project, going to the MPSCS.
Good. It all turned out well in the end. We had some excellent people working on the project, but it did demand a lot of hours, and there were a lot of things said behind closed doors that you wouldn't want said in public. But it's a wonder that most of these projects get done anywhere near on time or anywhere near on budget, because they're fraught with all these difficulties that you mentioned. And I've seen a lot of them firsthand, to the point where they're calling saying, you know, we have this truck here with this building on the back of it, this cast concrete building, and it doesn't fit through the gate. You can't make the turn, and this truck has to be back in Pennsylvania tomorrow morning. So what are you going to do with this building and this crane that we have here to offload it? I understand precisely what you're talking about. So thank you very much for a thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Councilmember Seal. Councilwoman McClellan.
Yeah, I agree. As an interior designer by degree, I've been through a fair share of,
The dialog's not
corners.
matching.
Yeah, oh yeah, or discontinued fabrics, all kinds of, yeah, good stuff. So I totally understand. Quick question about the specific project for the, maybe you'll get into this later, but the kind of the timeline that you outlined here versus the timeline we discussed about the scrubbers and stuff is slightly different. Is that something you're going to bring up later? Like, we had talked about doing the study, the design, and the permitting, and then the bid, and the bond, and then the construction. That was slightly different than what we discussed here. I mean, it was similar, but it came up and I wrote it down, so.
Well, I do have the schedule for the odor control on the next, on the other set
On
of
the other one?
slides.
Okay.
I didn't quite follow your question. Maybe when I show that schedule, you could repeat
Yeah,
it.
it was just kind of the difference. I was just calling out that, you know, it is different than what you
The
called out
the
here. and-
sequencing will change
Yeah.
depending on
Depending on the
the
project.
project, and sometimes the financing source will change the sequencing, sometimes the permitting process will change the sequencing. So
That's what
that was an illustrative sequence, but, and fairly typical, but not all
But
the
not
time.
always, okay. And then I guess this may be a question for Todd, but is there, does it matter, or is there a specific staff member assigned to a project? Like, I mean, obviously, if it's wastewater treatment plant, or if it's rec center, or is there a staff member that's overseeing, or is it just kind of the city as a whole?
Well, typically in the department, so for instance, for the wastewater treatment project that we finished up, phase 2, I mean, certainly Bob is keeping an eye on it, but we're also partnering. I believe Brian mentioned about the full-time versus part-time on-site observations, and we had that part-time with Tim Arndt, right? Did I pronounce it correctly? So Tim works for Tetra Tech, but he's a on-site observer, inspector, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, when they're supposed to be doing that type of stuff. We work hand in hand, and so similarly with the roof at the rec center, we have, I mean, you got Carla, but also probably on a more frequent basis, typically you had our maintenance our maintenance worker out at the rec center, Brian Sproul. But again, we had the full-time observation, on-site observation. So we work hand in hand with those. You know, when we had the Michigan Ave project, you know, it was a combination, right? I mean, you had depending on what it was. If it was water and sewer, there's a good chance that Jeff from DPW was involved, maybe Gary, myself, just depending on what. But typically, it's a team approach. So I don't know if that, hope
Yeah,
that
yeah,
answers your question.
I was just curious if it was some kind of, or if it would be helpful to have some kind of a project manager designation for a staff member for each project, or if that's helpful, or if we're using outside source, like we used for the roof on the rec center, we had an outside person doing that and reporting back, but,
Right, that's what I would propose, to do it as a case by case and working with, so that we have Mays as kind of our construction advisors, if you will, project advisor with the on-site. So not only did they have someone there, every day, on site with observing and inspecting, they also had, Mays helped us with everything from administering the bidding it out to administering the contract and, everything in between. So I would recommend we do it in that manner versus hiring somebody additional, because we certainly don't have the current staffing to just have someone take away and be focused full-time on a big project like that.
thank you.
Thank you. I guess I want to start with going back to the bid process. I mean, you've worked on these types of projects. How many bids would you expect?
That varies.
I mean,
Varies
this
by
is
the
a
time of
very
year.
specialized
Yeah.
thing.
But it's all very easily assembled by mechanical and electrical contractors. It's unique, but the components are fairly common. So I think we're bidding at a good time of year. I bet we'll get 6 to 10 is my prediction
On this project.
on
For
yes.
this project? Okay.
Yet on the rec center roof project, we got one.
Right. Now, of that 6 to 10, I would assume there's going to be a percentage of people that are just going to be dismissed right off the bat as not being qualified? Or do you think these are going to be actual, because I guess that's what I'm getting at, is with the rec center, it was very disappointing that we had a bid. It would be nice to see others.
I think this is such a large project. I think it'll take hundreds of hours to put this bid together. I think those that we get, by and large, will be qualified.
Okay.
We might get one or two that is their first rodeo, but I think,
That's a good point. When somebody bids on one of these projects, they are putting normally at least dozens of hours together, and on this one, as complex as it is, probably more than 100 hours just to put the bid together. There's a lot of investment that a contractor makes just to put a bid in.
If I may add, to even on a study, right, an RFP for a study, there's still, the package, if you do it right, they're putting significant dollars towards, maybe between $5,000 and $10,000, for instance, just to present a proposal to see if it's considered.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm kind of going to jump around because I was just sort of making a bunch of questions as we're going through. Now, during the construction, are we still going to have a smell issue? Is it going to be increased because things are going to be sort of out of sorts?
yeah, I think there could be times where it gets a little worse before it gets better. They will be removing covers and replacing it with new covers. While those old covers are off, some gases will escape that won't go through a treatment process. So,
And
I
are
would-
there methods that we can do to minimize?
I have tried very hard to think of those. They are identified in here, some of those, like covering them at the end of the shift. Yes, they can take it off while they're working on it, but making sure it's tarped or something at the end of the shift will help. I can't say it's going to get better every day. It probably will get worse some days, but I think we have some of those methods identified in here.
And just sort of a weird off-topic thing is, are we going to stop accepting sludge during this process?
We have not made that decision. Thus far, we've continued to move forward, but we certainly, if council directs us to do so, then that certainly is an option, but to date, we have not.
Okay, so we'll just kind of keep that on the radar then. Going to your slide, your flow chart, your engineer, what exactly, who is that? Who, is that a Tetra Tech? Is that, who is it sort of the project?
It's a consulting engineer. It's
Right.
a corporation,
Okay,
not an individual.
right. So is that a whole separate entity? Is that another body to the process?
Well, typically, who you pick to design it will help you all the way through to construction.
Okay.
So it's typically the designer and the construction administrator.
Would be the engineer. Okay. And so, I think we talked about, I had a notation about the competency of contractors, because assuming this was more of a specialized contractor field. So we feel pretty comfortable about that.
I would want somebody who has managed multidisciplinary public works projects.
Right.
I wouldn't want it to be their first public works project, but I think anybody that's done a wastewater project, a water treatment project, somebody that's managed mechanical trade, electrical trades, could in fact be successful.
And have we explored other communities that have done, you know, I want to use the word similar, although everything's going to be different because it's very specialized, but have we explored what other communities have done?
Who they've hired?
Who they've hired?
Contractor? No, I mean, we could do that. Your funding source requires the advertisement to be placed on a public website. And so you are obligated to entertain a bid from anybody who responds to that advertisement. You can invite contractors on top of that, and I've already reached out to some that I know have done good jobs in the past and just said, hey, watch out for this ad that will be placed on or around March 1st.
Okay.
So we can do that as well.
But part of what this also requires is that the contractor doing the bid give references and a list of comparable projects that they've done. So we can check those comparable projects to see what their experience is, and there are checks of the references to, and sometimes even those who aren't listed as references, if we know they've done a project someplace, we'll call and do some checking.
And then my last question is just referring to your slide regarding timelines. Is this the time frame that you used when you did your, I think this is what Mrs. McCullough was getting at. Is this what you're using as your basis for the timeline that was in our previous documents?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Just real brief. Having gone through a lot of construction projects, in my job, I understand the whole craziness, because even if you have stuff written in these documents, it doesn't necessarily go the same, and the design issue really does become a problem when you're looking at it. Because they have an idea versus what is going to be practical. So whatever we can do ahead of this game is what we need to do, because as we've experienced, the recourse that we tried to do with the other projects that have failed just isn't possible. It's just more expensive, and we never really get to the solution we want. We just need to do it right from the outset. So in terms of hiring our inspector, I can't recall, did Mays recommend the individual, or did we pick it? I want to know how independent they are from our engineer and our contractor in terms of how we select them.
Well, we contracted with Mays. It's one of Mays' employees.
So it was one of their actual employees that
Yes.
inspected the run.
Right. We entered into a contract with them to provide the service.
So in our situation, would we basically recommend a bid out for somebody to do this purpose, for the sewer proposal? Or-
Well, what I would say is, as Brian alluded, typically, whoever engineering firm you use to design it, you stay with them and carry it through to the end. I would suggest that we would ask a proposal from Tetra Tech for that cost. and that they would have.
Normally, it's good to stay with the design engineer to do the inspection, because what you're inspecting for is to make sure it complies with the contract documents and with the design. And what I've seen when, I've seen communities bid out the construction engineering or the project oversight separately. MDOT has done that. They'll design stuff in-house and then bid out the, and what happens is you end up with this at the end. Because the contractor's pointing the finger at the design professional, the person doing the inspection is pointing the finger at the contractor and the design professional, and the person who's caught in the middle is the owner. So generally, I think it's better, unless you've got problems with your design professional and you've got concerns about that, to go with the same design engineering firm with the oversight.
Yeah, that was just my understanding, the independence of that inspection versus who you're hiring, because you're kind of inspecting like the fox and hen house.
A little bit, but the fox that you're trying to keep out is really the contractor at that point. You're trying to make sure the contractor does it in accordance with the design documents. If you've got a design defect, you know, some of the cases where we've had design defects in the past, we haven't been able to get to the design professional. For instance, earlier in the rec center roof history, the design professional is now out of business, so there's no way to go back and say you did a lousy job. In some cases, we've had situations like with the rec center roof, where construction standards and methods and design methodologies have changed over the years. So when you're looking at roof systems, 2018 roof systems are much different than roof systems were back in 1981.
And the only thing is, I'm glad that we identified in here about having as-built drawings, because I think if you don't have that, you've got a shortage of problem. You know,
Right,
just
and
don't know where stuff is.
We also, you know, the one thing that Mays did that was really helpful is, as they uncovered things, they took pictures of the conditions as they were uncovered, and then took pictures of what was done in the work before it was covered up, so they have a good photographic or video record of everything that occurred.
Mr. Hart, please.
Okay, thank you. Most of my questions have already been asked, but I would observe or ask if there's been any thought given to full-time or part-time on-site observation. And I would add to that, I entirely concur with the mayor that we should get the best on-site observation we can. That's the most appropriate for this job, because I think that's a really important piece.
No, there hasn't, that's kind of a little bit of cart before the horse, but this is primarily above ground, so it's very easy to do this part-time. I think a part-time will serve the city well, and you'll get a good, cost-effective observation out of that. So.
Okay, yeah, my only point would be, we just need what we need. We need to have good on-site observation. Right. And I also wanted to say thank you for this. This was, I myself have lived the this old house dream in my personal life. So I know a little bit about some of the complications, but of course, nothing on this scale. And I have to confess, I never really gave a lot of thought to how very complicated this all is. So thank you very much. This is very...
If I might, just really quick, I mean, we could certainly ask Tetra Tech to give us, you know, a proposal for both, you know, full-time, part-time, sure, and then make that decision.
Along, maybe with pros and cons.
Yes.
I don't see the agenda, why we shouldn't do that.
Generally, that seems like a good night to do that when we get the bids in.
Right.
In part because some contractors require more time than others. And that's the most polite way I can say it, and I think I know who is in each camp, so.
Some project managers require
Yeah.
more time than others.
Very good. Gentlemen, thank you again. Are there questions for either Mr. Brian Rubel, Mr. Smith, or any member of our team of city staff members? No, then let's transition. Mr. Rubel, Mr. Brian Rubel, of course, maybe spend about 10 minutes updating us on ongoing efforts to mitigate noxious odors at the wastewater treatment plant. Then we can maybe do a quick round of questionings, but I do have to wrap this up right around 7:30.
I have only about 3 or 4 slides, so that fits the time frame quite well. So we're really in the home stretch with the design process, so it's quite timely.
If it's, excuse me, if it's more convenient for you, you're welcome to use the handheld. Yep. Just make sure the light's on at the bottom. It's got an on-off switch.
On? Better? No? All right, we'll use this one for the time being. So, Mitch, could you maybe look at the next slide? Okay. Very good. I don't think, all right. The funding status, we had a very dry public hearing last fall, but it was a necessary step to keep the city on track with the funding. And I'm pleased to report we're in great shape. We've met all the deadlines as I would always expect. And we're expecting still that $100,000 of principal forgiveness to help pay for the cost of the project. So we really took some things out of order on this project. The intention of the state is to be 100% defined with our plan in June, and we were not, the Webster schedule was such that we didn't get to that point in August. So to really make this funding happen this year, to me is quite an achievement. I can't tell you how many hours I spent on the phone with the DEQ to keep Saline eligible. So I'm very proud of how we were able to do that and make that happen. So very unusual, but we're there. And just to show you where we stand with some of the deadlines, the first permit review is due February 16th. That went in last week, so we beat that by a few weeks. We're required to advertise for bids by March 23rd. We're going to suggest we do that March 1st, keep that going. March 15th, Ides of March, we're going to have a pre-bid meeting with contractors. We like that process. It tells us who's interested in the project. It forces them to listen to some key parts of this contract that we can review with them in person so they don't miss it. They don't come back later and try to say they missed it. So we're going to have that right here in this room on March 15th. And we're required to have a 30-day bid period for the loan. So early April, that'll be up. So we're going to open bids on April 3rd. And I'll be back in front of you on April 16th with an armful of bids. And 6 to 10, I hope, or more, and with a recommendation on how to proceed with that. The loan closing is mid-June. The next slide will come back to that. So I don't know exactly the date. I think your financial planners do. They don't always share that with me, but we're well ahead of that with getting bids in April. And it does take, our estimate is it takes a year from the time we authorize the contractor to get all the equipment, get all the concrete poured, get all the systems hooked up. That's the same schedule we've talked about for months now. A schedule constraint, again, I just put we think it'll take about 6 months to get all the equipment here after the contractor is authorized to start. And the biological scrubber, it's a biological process, so it's affected by temperature, warm, cold, what have you. We're fairly certain that there's an acclimation period for these microorganisms to progress, reproduce, get established, and that we believe the manufacturers are going to insist on having a warm month to go start that process, and then we require that equipment to be tested to demonstrate that it's meeting specification. And we're going to require that to be done a couple of times over about a 6-week period, just so that we know before we accept that equipment that we're happy with the performance of it. So that really is going to push the completion of this until very early 2019 to get that warm weather. We're going to be in the fall, the late fall, the colder temperatures before that equipment arrives. So we really think that that's the completion date. Will be, late spring of 2019. So again, the schedule, we think the equipment will be on site late this year. They'll work on it late fall through the winter, get all the electrical hooked up, concrete will be poured, all the duct work will be in place. Then they'll start that startup when the warm weather hits in April. And in May and June, we're going to do the testing to validate that everything is functioning. Mitch, you can move it. So there's 3 questions. I've met with staff a few times and some of our preliminary talks. There's a couple questions that come forward from that. And we had talked about whether we actually issue a notice to proceed to the contractor before the loan closing date mid-June. If you refer back to the previous slide, we could do that. I'm not certain it's going to buy us early completion because we need to wait for that warm weather in 2019. So I can come back to these one by one perhaps. So I certainly would like some input on that. In staff, we also talked about whether we issue financial incentives for the contractor, like a daily rate if he's done early. Do we reward him for that? Again, I'm not certain that, because we're waiting for that warm weather in 2019, I'm really not certain if that's going to be effective, because we have to wait for that weather. And we also talked, number 3, with staff about, and one of the council members asked about it earlier, the impact on the public of the project. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that and how you wish to engage with them during this project. We talked with staff about having, for sure, communication through your newsletter we talked about. And then we talked a little bit about public meetings and other things. I don't think we made any definitive plans to do that. So those were 3 things that I hope to get some input on here this evening. We hope so, but they clearly have been, Mr. Smith's question was, given that a lot of this will be done during the winter, won't that mitigate the impact on the residents? And clearly we hope so, but I also know that this winter, Mr. Skull has entertained many calls about odors, and so that's important too, that we do what we can in the winter.
So quickly, Mr. Rubel, first, with the exception of page 5, I think it'd be valuable if this PowerPoint, a hard copy, was made available to the public outside in the lobby, and then also if it could be put online, unless there's objections from the dais. I think it's relevant, timely, and important. As it relates to your questions on items 1 and 2, I'm policy, not operations. At the same time, I want you all to be very thorough and precise, but I want to move as expeditiously as possible. So balancing the 2, if you can move quickly, if doing some of these things out of the normal sequence allows us to implement the changes faster, then I would say do that. But I would leave it to your judgment and the judgment of staff. As it relates to the 3rd question about public input, certainly using our website, social media, our FYI newsletter that goes out quarterly with the utility bills. I would also recommend an approach, however, very similar to what we did during the 2016 Michigan Avenue reconstruction, which was a weekly email blast and press release to our local media contacts. Mr. CEO, any comments, questions?
I have none.
Okay. Ms. McClellan?
Yeah, I did have one about, so the testing will happen in June or when the weather warms up in 19.
Correct.
But will it potentially be, I mean, it'll be there, it'll be working throughout the winter, I mean, as soon as it's installed, so it's just that final testing to
Yeah.
make sure that it's working properly that'll be happening in June. So potentially for residents, we would see a change as soon as it gets installed.
That's a great question. It very well may be running, and again, I don't know, I don't have the contractor schedule, but it very well might be running in, say, March.
Okay.
In April, May, so it could be running and treating the air just fine. We just haven't released the
Just can't test
contractor
it. Right.
from the requirements.
So in that 6 months, it has to be on site, or it doesn't come on site for 6 months, so that would be fall of 18. So then the installation would happen like November, December of 18?
I think that's where a lot of the site work will be done.
Okay, so there's potential that residents could see, I mean, not guaranteed, but
Right.
could see a change in odor and all the issues that we've been dealing with that as soon as that early. I mean, it won't be completed because we can't test it, but,
Well, yeah, keep in mind, it might take a month or two to hook it up,
Okay.
to get the mechanical system, the electrical system, so, but clearly before June, I think it will be treating air.
right, okay, great, thank you.
Ms. Dillon?
Okay, I've got two questions. Is there any opportunity that we can simulate warm weather? Can we tent it and create the environment in the winter instead of actually waiting till the spring?
No, we'd have to heat the air. That's the issue, is how do you get the heat in the air? And we're relying on Mother Nature to heat the air. So
Right.
tenting it,
We could tent it and put heaters in there.
well,
I mean,
maybe we could.
I'm just trying to explore other options
the-
of not having to wait till spring.
The manufacturers who have to certify this, they have to tell us we're ready to test it, have never done that. So it would be a cost to the contractor, and you would have to compensate them. I don't even know if they will agree to do it that way.
Okay. It's something I would like to at least,
I mean, I've asked them those
Okay.
questions, and they've never done it. So
Okay.
at least one contractor doesn't want to do it and would not bid on the project if he's forced to do it.
okay. The other thing is, what is the actual temperature that you're looking at, that you're thinking April to mid-May? I mean, is it,
Well,
40 degrees, 60
Yeah, it's 40 to
degrees?
50, something like that, over a longer period of time.
Okay,
It's the duration is
Right.
as much part of it as anything.
okay. So theoretically, if we were to have a bad winter that extended out, it could still even push this further, do you think? Or are you sort of trying to build in a window of thinking by April?
My hope is that's conservative. That 6-week window to acclimate the bugs might only need to be 4, but if we plan for 6, we're good.
Okay. Okay. And then my last question is on page 4. I just wanted to clarify here where it says, on this slide, deliver, install. So fall of 18, it's going to be delivered, and it's not going to install till winter of 19?
I'm not sure how you define winter. It will probably be delivered late 2018, installed through the winter. The completion of the installation will probably be in calendar year 2019. That,
Okay, so when you're saying winter, you're thinking January, February-ish? Okay.
Correct.
Not the back end of waiting all the way to...
oh, no.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
no, not the end of
Thank you.
2019. No, that's a
Thank
good
you.
question.
I just wanted that
Yep,
clarification.
Yep.
Mr. Gearbaugh?
Just real quick, so when you mentioned testing, it's going to be done in cold and warm because we're running into the issue right now when it's -0 and it really smells. So how is that going to be tested? to
It
make
can,
sure
o-
that
it can
complies?
only be tested in that window of time unless you leave the contract open, which I don't think we want to do. So it will be tested. The specification will require that to work under all scenarios, all temperature scenarios. So we can only test it in the weather that we have. We can't equally bring in ice and make it cold.
No, I'm not asking about, I agree it's got to be open to exposure,
Yeah.
but I want to make sure that we don't have a plant that, oh yeah, it's fine at 32 degrees to 60, and then ends up being a problem at 0.
It's designed to operate under cold air conditions. I just can't force those conditions and have it tested.
But we could.
You could-
mentioned in the
yeah.
contract, we can make a requirement that at some point does have to be tested.
The contractor will
Doesn't
require it
apply.
to meet a performance specification year-round. It just isn't required to test it before you complete the job. Does that
As long
make
as
sense?
yeah.
Okay.
That's why I want to make sure that we've
Yeah.
got a recourse in the fact that.
You will have a recourse. You will.
The other piece of it is, and when you mentioned incentives or disincentives, my concern is I want to make sure that that project is ready to run March 1st. They flip a switch so that when they're going to do their testing, that everything's wired up, everything that's needed there in order to make sure the testing goes, not to continue doing some, can we do it that way? If you're talking about incentives and such, we should have things done well ahead of time so that when that testing happens, that's the piece that we're really kind of dependent on.
Okay, I can't control the contractor's progress, but we can define the testing programming. In other words, we won't test it until he's 100% complete. But forcing him to be complete is his job.
Right.
but that's part of the contract terms to which what substantial completions have to happen during that period of time.
That's correct.
And I don't want to see that all of a sudden in December, he's only got 10% of it done when he could have done 50%, and he's trying to cram all of it into when he's got extra people on board. And that's where we run into the problem, all of a sudden something blows up in the middle of a short period of time.
I just cannot specify his milestones through the project. I can't do it. I can define it, what's ready to be tested, but all the little steps in between have to be up to the contractor.
I don't see the incentives.
We gotta speed up here, I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, if you
No.
have questions, please.
Yep, no questions. My questions have been asked.
Okay, you want to say something real quick?
No, I was just going to mention to the comment about incentives, and that was just something that we were talking about as a possibility, but, so we're not, certainly staff is not recommending that we do that. It was something we wanted to bring up and consider, have council think about that, so.
Ryan, we appreciate your time. Obviously, this is a multidimensional, complex issue that's of critical importance to our citizens, and we'll be discussing it more. Is there anything further to be brought up this evening? Then the chair would entertain a motion to adjourn this work meeting at 7:30.
So moved.
Moved by McClellan, is there a second? Seconded by Dillon. All those in favor of adjourning signify by saying aye. Opposed, say nay. Ayes have it, this meeting is adjourned. 5 minutes if you need to use the restroom.